Okay, welcome to this fifth session of International Road Safety Dialogues. As you know, this has been organized by Independent Council of Road Safety International. And today we are here for the fifth session of this international dialogue. My name is Geetam Tiwari. I'm a professor at the Civil Engineering Department and also associate faculty at Transportation Research and Injury Prevention Program at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. And we will be doing today session 5 and session 6. And we have a very illustrious guest today, the expert that you all have been waiting to hear today is Professor Ezra Hauer. Professor Ezra Hauer's CV and introduction is already available on the website, so I would not take too much time in reintroducing him. However, for the sake of formality, I still want to say a few words. Dr. Ezra Hauer is a professor emeritus in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Toronto, Canada. And he has been active in road safety research and consulting since 1970. So I think some important facts about him that I read especially in the two books that he has published. In the introduction to his book, which was first published in 1997, Observational Before and After Studies in Road Safety, Dr. Rune Elvik said, Howard does not respect the received wisdom, but asks fundamental questions. An excellent teacher, Ezra's ambition is obviously to turn the study of road safety into a proper science. And he has come a long way in doing that. And I thought I also wanted to quote one sentence from his next book, which is The Art of Regression Modeling, in which Ezra has said in the preface, the quality of meal depends more on the skill of the cook and the time spent on its preparation than on the modernity of the food processor. So, illustrious participants and my colleagues, we present the Michelin 3-star chef of road safety, Professor Ezra Hauer. Ezra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geetam. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a little bit strange to be speaking about road safety when our thoughts are being dominated by a different pandemic. But what we do is important and continues to be important. And I think it's therefore important that we do it well. So today's topic is crash causation and prevention. And I will be specifically dealing with crash causation studies and their relationship to crash prevention. So CCS stands for Crash Causation Studies. Crash causation studies are a special kind of study in which many, and by many I mean hundreds and thousands of crashes, are investigated in detail by a team of experts, mechanical engineers, accident reconstructionists, human factors experts, civil engineers, medical doctors, lawyers, all tend to be members of the investigating team. And the purpose of these studies is to influence, enhance, and make prevention efforts more efficient. That is the declared purpose of all of them. In the background to this first slide, I put several fronts of reports, and you see there are many of them. Some European, some British, some American. I did not have space for the old reports. These are more or less modern reports, last 10 10, 15 years or so. And what is interesting about these reports is, and I'll go to the next slide, is that they all find roughly the same thing. I'm told that the audience is composed of young researchers, or is perhaps not so young researchers. I'm certainly a very old researcher in this audience. But those familiar with road safety research will find that results are rarely very consistent, that we find more divergent results than results that agree with each other. However, the CCS are kind of unique in this respect. They all find roughly the same thing. And the studies that I reviewed, which span the period of 1975 to 2019, all find more or less that the road user is the sole cause of a crash in about 65% of them, and is a factor, a causal factor in a crash in almost all of them, 95% or so. The graphic on the left is a rather old one. It summarizes the first two kind of modern studies, beginning around 1972, 1975, one by Barbara Sabin Stoughton, and the other, the landmark study by Treat et al., the Indiana study. What do they find? I'll try to explain the graphic briefly. The road user is the sole cause in one of the studies of 65%, in the other study by 57%. The road and its environment, like the weather, is responsible, is the sole factor in only 2 or 3%. The vehicle is sole factor in 2%. The road environment plus the road user are factors in one study of 24%, in the other study, 27%. So now you see what this simple graph tends to represent. It's due to a Swedish researcher, Kåre Rumar, who was a very fertile mind in road safety research. Well, but this is what they all find. And if this is what they all find, if in 2/3 of the crashes, the road user is the sole cause, well, if so, then it might be natural to focus on the road user as the target of most of our preventions. And this is what many road safety management systems tend to do. Focus on prevention being the road user and their action, like the lady who is painting her lashes while driving. But my question is whether this is indeed so, whether what all these studies consistently find is reality. And just by asking the question, you might think that I will answer in the negative. And so I want to try and give you chapter and verse of my argument why this is not so. In order to answer the question that I'm posing, the is that so question, I need to pose two fundamental issues, two fundamental questions. What are the causes of crashes? And more importantly, how should one link cause to prevention? So what then is this slippery concept of cause. I divide the screen into two parts. In the left part, there is the metaphysical notion of cause. We all in our life feel that there are some regularities, that one thing follows regularly another. And we imbue this notion with the concept of causality, which is more as an internal to our soul feeling. But this metaphysical notion of cause was the subject of philosophical inquiry from the times of Plato, and it still is. And what has been written on the concept can fill a small library, and there is still very little agreement between philosophers on how to define this feeling of cause that we have and what are the limits of it, of these definitions. But on the right-hand side, I speak of a different kind of cause. I call it instrumental, or cause that serves some kind of purpose. And if you start searching for cause in the internet, you will find a plethora of causes. Cause in fact, but for cause, proximate, ultimate, primary, root. There is no end to this. Each of these concepts of cause is defined to serve a purpose, some for law, some for fault analysis, some in engineering, some in medicine, like primary cause of death, and so on. Every definition, every such instrumental cause has some features that distinguish it from some other causes, and this whole makes for a real Gordian knot of definitions. It's really difficult to find its core. But the important thing is that these are all definitions that serve some kind of purpose. And it's the purpose that fashions the definition of cause. So our purpose is crash prevention. And if so, our question is, what should be crash cause when the purpose is crash prevention? And I need to spend a little bit of time on clarifying by what I mean by crash prevention. I think crash prevention consists of actions intended to reduce the probability of this underlying word future occurrences. Because often when we speak of causes of crashes, we refer to some event that already passed. The distinctive feature of prevention is that we speak of preventing future crashes. And so I do not think that this notion of crash prevention is controversial. So I take it as agreed upon. And so with this definition of crash prevention, what then is crash cause when prevention is the purpose? I referred earlier to this Gordian knot of all kinds of causes. And to unravel it, I will pick a loose strand, pull on it, and see whether it leads me to gradually unravel this bundle and see what cause for prevention is. So I will start to question this loose strand. Is it true that the road user is the sole cause in 65% of crashes? And to discuss this, a real example will help. And the example is a bit painful, and I treat it with great respect. The red arrow is on the Armley corner. That's an intersection in Saskatchewan of Highway 35, which you see in front of you in the picture, and Highway 335 that comes in from the right behind that clump of trees. There was a bus going on Highway 35 carrying the Bronco, Humboldt Bronco hockey team, which is a junior team. It collided with a tractor trailer coming from the right, from Highway 335. It had a stop sign with a flasher, but did not stop or slow down before entering the intersection. The bus driver could only see it belatedly, started braking about 24 meters before the trailer was already in the intersection, hit it. You can see the wreckage in the top left corner. 16 young boys died. The weather was good. There was no alcohol involved, visibility perfect, no ice or snow on the ground, no slippery pavement. As you can imagine, there was a dark cloud over the country. People grieved because these are young boys, because hockey is so important in Canada. The TV coverage lasted weeks. There were church and synagogue and mosque services and statements of support and in fact, factual monetary support. Everybody was affected. What was the aftermath of this national tragedy? Well, I could find only 3 prevention actions. There was, of course, a trial. The driver of the semi-trailer was the defendant. One can think of it as a kind of general deterrence preventive action, just raising the consciousness of the danger of this kind of behavior. The province of Saskatchewan, the Ministries of Highway and Infrastructure, MHI, asked for an engineering report of the Armley corner. What are the deficiencies and what might be corrected at that corner? But really the only substantive preventive action was that all the ministers of transport from all the provinces got together with the Federal Minister of Transport and agreed that from now on there will be mandatory entry-level training, MELT, for new truck drivers. Prior to this accident, I think only Ontario and perhaps another province had MELT in place. After the crash, there is a formalized program of training and testing which goes under this MELT acronym. Throughout all this, I was really wondering, there were weeks of TV and media coverage and grief and struggle, but prevention was not the focus. There was very little talk about what to do in the future, how to prevent. This was not the first crash involving sports teams going to competitions. Happens all the time. It was so little talk about prevention. And the prevention you can see here, to my mind, in my opinion, was very inadequate, particularly due to the fact that MELT was already shown to have an insignificant effect on track crashes. And clearly, it has very little to do with the truck driver running a stop sign, because every driver knows that they are in mortal danger when they do it. They don't need training for that purpose. In any case, I would like to concentrate not on prevention, because that's my private beef, not on this prevention, that's my private beef, but on the cause and the investigation of the cause. Of course, the crash was thoroughly investigated, reconstructed. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police was involved. The Federal Ministry of Transport helped with the investigation. The verdict was that these are the actions of Mr. Sidhu, the truck driver, that caused the collision. Okay, of course. But were the trees not also a cause? You look at the top right hand side, and I did a small calculation. The bus driver had about 0.5 seconds before he could see the tractor trailer entering. And the tractor trailer entering from the right certainly could not see the bus approaching. Well, the lawyers and the judge said no, the trees were not a cause. And they elaborate. They explain that trees were not a cause because had the truck driver stopped at the stop sign, he could see the bus approaching. So it's him not stopping, which is the cause. The trees had no function in it. This MHI report did not speak of causes, but certainly recommended removing the trees from the corner of this intersection. So why is it that the legal system, what's called the agreed upon statement of cause, said that the truck driver was the sole cause in this case? They said so because the purpose of the legal system was to establish guilt or innocence. That is, in law, done by the but-for test. Let me explain. The but-for test is the test by which the legal system establishes cause and subsequently liability and degree of liability. And it's defined by the defendant's action is a cause if, but for that action, the harm would not have occurred. Now, clearly, but for Mr. Sidhu not stopping, the crash would not have occurred. But the same cannot be said about the trees in the corner. Had Mr. Sidhu done what he has done, irrespective of whether the trees are there or not, the trees would not have been the cause of the crash. So in crashes, translating the but-for test for crashes, in crashes, a circumstance or an action is a cause if but for it, but for that circumstance or action, the crash would not have occurred. So the trees were not the cause because the trees in the corner cannot pass the but-for test. Only Mr. Sidhu's action can pass the but-for test. Now you ask, why am I talking about the definition of cause in law? And the answer will become clear very soon. But here I just want to point out the difference. We have different purposes. The purpose of the legal system is not crash prevention, and our purpose is not the determination of guilt and liability. And therefore, if using the legal test, the but-for test, for our problem, for our purpose, we end up with a big problem. And here is what the problem is.
Ezra,
Yes.
I would like to just ask you a short question here, because the process you have described, that how the case has been analyzed and in the court of law, what the discussion is. So this has a very, I find, what you have said, the purpose was to establish guilt and liability. For that in the law, but for test is used. I find a very strong resonance in this process with the crash investigation that I have read of the first reported crash of pedestrian involving a pedestrian and a test vehicle in an exhibition ground. And this was in London in perhaps in 1898 or 99. And a lady was hit by this, it was called a horseless carriage, which could go only at a maximum speed of 13 kilometers per hour. And the incident was so unusual that there was a thorough investigation by the court. And if you read the process, it's exactly what you have described. So my question is, why has the process of court investigation remained unchanged after 120 years?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot answer it from the legal perspective. Although at the end of this presentation, I will show you a reference of the paper on which this presentation is based. And in that paper, I do provide a kind of a side which might be an answer to your question. Because I did try to see where does the but-for test stem from. And it is being discussed in the legal literature, of course, very, very extensively, this being the prevailing doctrine. When a legal scholar in law review, Fordham Law Review, I think it was, discussed the sources of the but-for law, he referred to the source as hiding in the mist of history. So it must have very, very long roots. And he is saying that because he begins to discuss the but-for law from 1920. So already in 1920,
Yeah.
it must have been hiding in the mist of history. But speaking as a layman, as a non-lawyer, it makes a great deal of sense, of common sense, to say, I don't want to speak of many, many causes. I want to speak of one cause. And the one cause on which I can put my finger is the but-for cause. I think it makes a good sense, makes a good sense to me, perhaps to you, perhaps to audience.
Yeah.
But I think it most disturbingly, it makes good sense to most of my friends and most of the public who think that on the road crashes are caused by bad drivers. It's the other guy who is the bad driver, but it's the driver who is the cause. So I think there is a big kind of psychological bubble that supports the use of this kind of cause. I'm not sure that I answered your
No,
question, but
no, that's
it has
fine.
some
We
point.
go, yes. And we wait for the end of the presentation. As you said, at the end of it, we get more information.
Yeah, at the end of the presentation, I give a reference to the paper so
Yes.
you can read up what more I have to say on this particular subject. Should I continue now?
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. So just to reiterate, the law has one purpose, we have a different purpose. And using their test for our purposes leads to a problem. It's a logical problem. Take, for example, intersection side distance. I'm referring to the trees in the army corner. Research shows that if you improve poor intersection side distance, you reduce crashes. This is empirical research. But the but-for test says that insufficient side distance is not a crash cause because it doesn't pass the but-for test. So we have a contradiction here. It would look like there can be effect. You can reduce crashes, but the effect has no cause. And that's untrue in our life in general. Isaac Newton, when he stated his first law of motion, says the thing will remain at rest unless you cause a change by force, and it will continue moving unless you cause it to stop. There is no effect without cause in our entire life. All engineering and all human action is based on the fact that if there is an effect, there is a cause. And even philosophers, or at least some of them, now recognize this central fact. And those of you who are interested in the philosophy of cause and effect, there is a marvelous book called Making Things Happen, written by a philosopher, Woodward, who gives a very coherent account of cause and effect from our point of view of people who want to make change. And coming back to my opening slide, all crash causation studies used a but-for test as their definition of cause. This, I think, is their central weakness. All my human factors friends tell me not to put too many words on a slide. So I'm not asking you to read all these words, but I will just kind of spot some of them. I was a part or an outside part of one of these studies. You see the word FMCSA, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. One of the crash causation studies was the large truck crash causation study. It was done in 2006, but the ideological roots, the thinking roots go back to 1972, to Perchono, who struggled with the question, what should I call cause in crash investigations? And he coined the notion of critical event, that behavior which transforms a situation into one which almost certainly results in, without a miracle, results in a crash. And that is at the core of the but-for definition. 1975, Barbara Sebe, one of the pioneer researchers at the Transport Road Research Laboratory, at the time it was the Road Research Laboratory, did a study and defined as causal factors those without which the accident would not have happened, and but for definition. And so it goes on the same way in all these crash causation studies. The Indiana study, the Treat et al. Study, the same, but for definition of a cause. And that is the root of the problem. The root of the problem is, well, there are several roots, but one of them is that now we lose the link between crash and prevention. And I want to illustrate it by quoting from this, the same large truck crash causation study that I mentioned earlier. They wanted to explain what is a critical event and what is the critical reason. From the event, the one from which there is no recovery unless by miracle. So they want to explain to the reader what is the critical event and what is the critical reason. And they use an example, and you have it in quotation marks. I'm just looking at how much time I have. Okay, I think I'm doing more or less all right. The example they give is that there is an SUV, approaches a signal, wants to turn left, and is hit in the intersection by a wrecker. A wrecker is like a tow truck, which cannot avoid the crash. So you can imagine this SUV wanting to turn left, the wrecker coming into it, the two are crashing. They cannot avoid the crash. That's the critical event. This is the explanation of the critical event, illustration in their document. And then they say the critical reason for this crash is that the driver failed to look or looked but didn't see. You must know that in this LTCCS study, each crash, and I think there were hundreds or perhaps thousands of them, each crash had about 200 factors coded. In this particular explanations, they say the vehicle was perfect. There was nothing coded as a factor for the vehicle. The environment was perfect. There was nothing coded as a factor for the SUV. Now, I assume that many of you are not North Americans. In North America, we have this peculiar signalization system in which when a green light shows, a solid green ball shows, you may turn left if there is no opposing traffic, like the situation described here. In much of Europe, and I assume in other countries, you may not turn left against traffic. Your turn will be protected by a left turn signal, such as an arrow shown there in the bottom right corner. Now, they say the critical reason was failed to look or looked but did not see. What countermeasure comes in mind when that is the critical reason, the cause? Well, really, I cannot think of many countermeasures. But there is an obvious countermeasure here at this particular intersection, that is to make the signal into a protected one, into an error protected one, rather than a permissive one. But when you say critical reason is failed to look or looked but not seen, the link between the cause and the crash is not self-evident. So confining yourself to critical events and critical reasons will not link to obvious countermeasures and obvious corrective actions. There's a systemic bias in the but-for test. And the bias is this. There is almost no circumstance that is present or action that has occurred minutes before the crash that can pass the but-for test. I can think of only maybe a deep hole in the pavement is being there minutes before the collision and still passing the but-for test. Conversely, what the road user did or did not do just seconds before the crash will almost always pass the but-for test. And so the 65, 95% numbers, which are railed against at the beginning, are really not a finding. They are a necessary consequence of defining cause by a but-for test. I could have been sitting at home in my armchair, and if you ask me how many crashes, what proportion of crashes will the road user be a cause, I could tell you almost all of them. I don't need to go out and investigate anything. And this understanding that events have more than one cause has been there for almost 2,000 years already. I give you this quote from Marcus Aurelius, his Meditations. So there are very few crashes which have one cause. Causes are usually many, and we need a definition of cause which links cause to prevention. These are the issues to be addressed. And here is a proposed definition. And I only changed few words. There are many others who favor this definition, particularly my friend and mentor, Frank Hague, who was, by the way, the founding editor of Accident Analysis and Prevention and several other transportation journals. The proposed definition reads as follows. The cause of a crash is a circumstance or an action which, had it been different, the probability of such crashes to occur would have been different. I happen to think that this definition too has much in common sense to recommend it, but it has consequences, important consequences. A circumstance or action is a cause if there are two criteria met. One, it could be different. The circumstance or action could be different. Because it cannot be different, then for our purposes, it's of no interest. And B, that it would, had it been different, it would affect the probability or severity of crashes to occur. So while the legal system, or perhaps a crash CCS, would say that the Bronco crash had only Mr. Sidhu's actions caused, in fact, there are many other causes. And I already argued that the present intersection side distance is a cause. But the prevailing regulations of traffic hours of core work is a cause. They could be different, and if they were different, they would affect the probability and severity of future crashes. The speed limits could have been different. I didn't mention it, and it may sound strange to you, but both these roads in Saskatchewan have a speed limit of 100 kilometers per hour. And in fact, the bus was going about 100 and the truck was going about 100 as established by the reconstruction. I don't think that in Ontario, similar roads would have such speed limits. I think our speed limit would be about 80 kilometers per hour. So the current speed limits surely were a cause of this particular crash and similar crashes in the future. And once you name the causes in this manner, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, you can also think about clues to prevention. Surely, if sight distance is a factor, it was a factor, causal factor in this crash, then a reasonable action in Saskatchewan would be to look at all the rural two-lane road intersections or similar intersections and see whether there are sight distance obstructions. And the countermeasure would be to remove the obstructions, to correct these deficient interests. That would be prevention. And if should it turn out that fatigue is a causal factor in many of such crashes, then changing the prevailing regulation or the technology of it, or the legislation or the inspection would be appropriate. So once you name a cause, you can think of countermeasures. Obviously, the same is true of the speed limit. The second consequence is the broadening of the class of causes. In the previous slide, I had the words present, prevailing, current. This is what can be seen at the crash of the site. But what is absent can also be a cause. And it may sound a bit revolutionary to say, for example, here I show there were no transverse rumble strips on the secondary road to alert Mr. Sidhu that he's approaching a stop sign. And so the question is, would their absence be a cause in this crash? And my claim is that they would be. The same way as somebody not wearing the seat belts, the absence of seat belt wearing, would a be a cause if that person is severely injured in a crash. So absent and present are really two sides of the same coin. Neither the bus nor the truck had any ADAS features. It's possible that if the bus was equipped with a forward collision warning system, the bus driver might have started braking sooner and the severity of the crash diminished. There are very many countermeasures already being used and shown efficient in Victoria and Australia, in Minnesota, alerting side road drivers to the approaching main road traffic. All these were absent. Is their absence not a cause? I'm arguing that if you adopt the suggested definition of cause, the consequence is to render things that are absent to be a cause too. The third consequence, all the CSS studies recorded as cause only when something was contrary to the norm. So a vehicle was not a cause if the tires were not worn or if the brakes were not defective. A traffic sign, a road was a cause only if the pavement was too slick or the stop sign absent or obscured, and so on. But that again is the fault of the but-for definition. The trees in the corner are a cause not because they do not comply with the prevailing standards used by Saskatchewan highways, and there is such a standard. They are a cause because they increase the chance of a crash. Not wearing seatbelts is not a cause because doing so is illegal. It's a cause because they increase, not wearing it increases the severity of injury. The same argument for stop sign running. So norms do not determine what is cause. The change in probability or severity is the arbiter of what is or is not a cause. And yet, all CCS studies define cause related to vehicle and road only if it doesn't comply with the norm. Otherwise, they don't list it as a cause. I believe that I already covered what I intended to say in this course, so I'll skip to the next one. In CCS, if something complies with the road design standards and practices, with the traffic control variants and practices, with urban planning and guidelines and practices, Geetam, that is to your liking, and if something complies with current laws and policies, then it is not recorded as cause and factor. If something is not recorded as cause and factor, it is not clue to prevention action. Because we inquire about causes in order to have clues to preventive actions. Compliance with a norm does not remove a circumstance or action from being a crash cause. So, for example, the Bronco drivers did not speed, I already mentioned it. In this case, speed limit is the norm. So, nobody in the entire discussion following the crash, the Hamburg Broncos crash, mentioned the speed limit as a source of prevention action. But according to suggested definition, speed limit could be lower, and if the speed limit was less, then crashes would be less severe. Therefore, speed limits are a cause, and thinking that they are not fails to consider a potential prevention action. And the final consequence. The final consequence is perhaps the most important or most relevant to policy. I argue that in Canada, the safety management system still lives in the blame the driver age and has not effectively adopted the safe systems approach. The old-fashioned road user-oriented style of road safety management is given support, ideological, quasi-science support by the crash causation studies, which put the driver and at the center of causation, and the crash causation studies are all faulty because they use the but-for test to determine causation. In contrast, the suggested definition creates the required balance for the safe systems approach in safety management, which resides on recognizing the road user as being responsible for reasonable behavior, and at the same time recording our human nature, errare humanum est, and puts responsibility on those who provide the transportation system and manage the transportation system, which is the state in its various forms, for doing so responsibly too, and taking safety consequences into consideration. And that particular subject will be the core of the next presentation.
Okay.
So here is the reference to the paper where you can find chapter and verse and many other topics related to crash causation and prevention. And back to you, Geetam, for questions and answers.
Yes. Thank you, Ezra, for covering this very interesting topic. And before I take up, we have got some very nice questions for you. But I would like to pose one question, that in this part, you also talked about the importance of including what is not present in crash causation. And especially you also talked about that we cannot only focus on compliance with the current standards and norms, because that rules out the many possible strategies that may involve questioning and revising the current norms. So Professor Bill Haddon, uh, in mid 60s perhaps, he proposed that famous Haddon matrix, a 3 by 3 matrix to look into factors involving the human, vehicle, and environment, and in at least 3 time periods: pre-crash, at the time of crash, and after the crash. So this is mid 60s where he discussed and talked about that let us look at least 9 possible cells where preventive or action could be taken. And also I have come across another, maybe there are other theories also, but I have come across Professor Charles Perrow's literature, his famous book, The Normal Accidents, where he talked about, the complex systems. And one of the essential things there is to go back in time, several time periods, to look for possible preventive strategies, and similarly go forward in time periods for preventive strategies. So the question is that at least academics and researchers have known about this almost for 60, 70 years now. So why is it that even in the crash causation studies that you have discussed here, why this approach is not widely accepted by the practitioners or the crash investigating agencies? I mean, other than the legal system and police system.
Um, our world is a complex one. And while I think it is true that the crash causation studies, which I have mentioned and reviewed and discussed, all end up with the 65, 95 numbers predictably. And so the first question is, why did they not adopt this longer and more penetrating point of view of crashes having many causes, not just the causes immediately preceding the crash? And when I said that life is complex, it's difficult to know the answer to this. And in one particular case, I could follow the reasoning. And I mentioned earlier the name Perchonok as being the ideological forefather of the modern North American crash causation study. So he worked back in 1972, but the large track causation studies and then the following NHTSA study in 2006, 2010, I think, all adopted Perchonok. And Perchonok, when he struggles with this question, he says he's clearly cognizant of the fact that the immediate cause or the critical event, which he calls, is preceded by a chain of causes. And then he says, but going, I'm more or less quoting, or at least representing his thought process. And then he says, going back event after event leads into the foggy past, and it will not help us in prevention action. So he's arguing about it and thinking that you really have to stick close to the crash and not go into the foggy past where there will be many, many causes and you will not know what to do. And so his reasoning is really not logical, but pragmatic. He says, I have to come up with one cause And so I expected, I will select the host closest to the crash. That was his reasoning. Why did the modern North American studies accept Perchonok's approach? I don't know. But the truth is, and here is the kind of complexity of life that comes into play. Congress asked the executive branch, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, to come up with a program of countermeasures for large crashes. So here comes kind of a political motivation. I don't know why Congress deemed it appropriate at a certain point to ask the administration to do this, but the administration had to respond and the Congress allocated some money, they had to spend some money. They, and I'm purely speculating here, they had to come up with some way of responding to the congressional request. So they looked into the literature and found Perchonok as an attractive kind of predecessor in terms of a logical structure and adopted it. Or perhaps Nietzsche already had this in their mind. I don't know. The truth is that the study started by collecting data without having any plan of what questions are to be answered and what ways will we answer these questions. And once the data collection was almost complete, they started to ask, now what is it that we will use it for? So it was a non-systematic way of going about the research project. I'm not really providing an answer to your why question, just saying that it's difficult for us to know. If I was an investigative journalist, maybe I would go back into the hearings that preceded the congressional request. Maybe I would ask for the back and forth emails at the beginning of the study, but I'm not in a position to do so. So I'm not in a position to answer in a very conclusive way the question why. It's certainly true that Haddon and perhaps Frank Haight before him very clearly stated that it's not just the road user that you should be worried about, that there are many, you mentioned 9 different cells of action, and each has its countermeasures. It's therefore really perplexing to some extent why in parallel there are these crash causation studies which perpetuate this road user did it kind of mythology. This is as best that I can answer this question.
Yeah, and so let me just read out. We have some interesting questions for you posed by the participants. And first 2 questions are kind of related, and they are asking that how do you prioritize road engineering, vehicle engineering, and enforcement? And I'll read out the second question, which is kind of related to this. It says that we always talk about road trilogy. Do you think that is necessary to begin to talk about road tetralogy, considering the 4th, the technology?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the words of the second question.
Okay, the second question says, we always talk about road trilogy.
Road
trilogy. So we have three aspects looking at always.
Yeah.
As the first question says, road engineering, vehicle engineering, and enforcement. I mean, that person has put enforcement. But if you look at Bill Haddon also, we are looking at vehicle, user, and environment. So the person says that why don't we add technology also to it? So instead of 3, talk about 4 aspects. So the first is about prioritizing amongst this. And the second is why not add technology to this?
Prioritizing has I suppose, 2 components. One is, how do you prioritize amongst all the possible actions? But I take it the question also mentioned, how do you prioritize road-related prevention actions and enforcement? I'm not sure that the second part is let's put it this way. I do not say that one needs to prioritize one over the other. Rather, I think that amongst all the possible prevention actions, including enforcement and infrastructure and all the other possible actions, one should look at them together and, as perhaps in some cases, jointly reinforcing each other. So let me just deal with the question of prioritizing.
Okay, so we have.
Let me just follow the prioritization issue for a moment. My own background is engineering, so I'm kind of culturally predisposed of looking at prioritization as comparing costs and benefits, both costs and benefits in a very broad sense, not in monetary terms, and then coming to some opinion on that basis. And my argument in in the previous lecture was really that we have to look at all ways of intervention, not only at road user-oriented intervention. So in this sense, my kind of engineering sense of prioritization still makes sense to me. But in the next lecture, I'm making a very important concession, which I probably would not have made had I been much younger, and saying that I can only provide the facts in terms of costs and benefits, what I consider as facts, but that there are many things to which the judgment of more high level decision makers pertains, that there are really very few decisions in road safety that could be decided strictly by putting them into a kind of benefit cost kind of framework and software and compute what the outcome ought to be. But that will be the subject of the next lecture. So priorities, I think, should be based on facts. Facts should not be based on restricting them to one category of countermeasures, but should cover all possible approaches, including those for which the state is responsible.
Okay, so here we have a next question from Farooq Ahmed from Bangladesh. And his main concern is that in Bangladesh at present, there are no arrangements for speed enforcement and incident detection on highways. And he says that many drivers drive their vehicles recklessly. So his question is, if we give training to these drivers, is it not effective for reducing crashes on highways?
Thank you. I already mentioned my old age, so old age comes with a certain degree of humility. The only basis for which I have for trying to respond to this question is not that I have done research on the effect of education, although very paradoxically, I'm going to contradict myself. My master's thesis, so at that time I was really young, and I was doing a master's thesis in civil engineering. And what was the subject of my thesis? The effect of age and experience for novice drivers. I cannot really to this day understand how my advisor, who was also a civil engineer, allowed me to do without any preparation or education in the subject. This is so unrooted in any civil engineer. But in any case, coming back to the question whether education is important, and I do not want to invoke any North American experience with education because that will and try to make it relevant to Bangladesh, because what research we have is about how ineffective driver education tends to be in terms of preventing future crashes in North America. I believe that, and having lived in a more or less developing country for some time, I believe the driver education has an important role to play, not so much in its immediacy in terms of how Mr. X, after having been educated, will perform on the road in the few months afterwards, because after a few months, driver education tends to be of relatively little importance. But in terms of the cultural change in society, that the institution of driver education is helping with to change driving culture in a society over time. And I think in this context of a gradual change of driving culture in a society, driver education and testing plays an important role.
Okay. So we have a question from Jeroen Lebgoren. Aren't the researchers that looking for the sole cause are part of the problem? Could the bus driver have prevented the crash had he seen the truck trailer approaching with no intention to stop? I think
Let me
you answered
repeat.
this in your presentation.
Sorry?
I said, perhaps you answered this in your presentation.
Well, if I understood the question correctly, it also comes in two parts. The first part is about the researchers who tend to think in terms of sole cause. And the second part is, could the bus driver have prevented this particular crash? Am I reading the question correctly?
Yes, 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 that's right.
I think we have to distinguish here between speaking of the crash at the Army corner, the Humboldt Bronco crash, and prevention. The first part of the question is about prevention. What is it? Is it appropriate for the researchers to focus on sole cause? And I think I tried to answer the question in the presentation. If prevention of future crashes is our objective, then focusing on sole cause is counterproductive, retrograde, and helps to preserve the road user oriented road safety management approach, and therefore, in my opinion, wrong. The second part of the question relates to the crash that has occurred. So not the prevention of future crashes, but the particular crash, Bronco crash, and the question was, could the bus driver have prevented the crash? And the answer is not with the prevailing equipment, not in the prevailing circumstances. It was impossible for the for the bus driver to stop in time because he just could not see the truck approaching. By the time the truck was in the mid-intersection, he was 20 meters before the crash, before the truck. So he could not possibly have stopped. But that doesn't mean that for the prevention of future crashes of this kind, and crashes of this kind occur in Saskatchewan at rural intersections, or will occur in Saskatchewan at rural intersections. And if we are intent to prevent such crashes, then we have to consider, should we change the speed limits? Should we insist on side distances? Should we, at some intersections, replace the stop sign with some interactive system? Should we insist that when you carry on a vehicle more than X numbers, you have to have modern ADAS, and so on and so forth?
Yes. So we have a question from Brazil, Ronaro Ferreira. And he says that in Brazil, the police seek to identify the cause, the legal responsible for the crash. But there are teams which are working on multiple causes and looking at contribution factor. So the question is, there are more contribution factors than causes, and there are more prevention factors than contribution factors. Is that right? There are more contributory factors than causes, and there are more prevention factors than contribution factors.
We in discussions of this sort, it's really important to be clear about what the words mean. What is the difference between cause and prevention factor? How is a contributing factor different from cause, and so on? And it's very difficult to be clear in a question and answer period about what the questioner means and how the respondent answers. So I'm not sure I want to deal with the distinction between contributing factors and causes. I would perhaps put the two together, saying that there are many causes, and what you call a contributing factor is also a cause. If it's contributing, that must mean that had it been different, the outcome would have been, the probability of the outcome would change. So that would come under my, what I call cause.
Cause. Yeah.
And now the distinction between cause and prevention action is really a somewhat subtle one. So the questionnaire is right in saying that the same cause can have several prevention actions. For example, if the cause is running a stop sign, then the prevention action could be, removing the trees, putting transverse rumble strips in front of the intersection, perhaps changing the work hours legislation, all the factors that I mentioned. So the same cause can have several prevention actions. It's also possible, or it's most likely, that a certain prevention action can have several causes that are altered by it. But the difference between, firstly, it's very good that there is a close link between cause and prevention action, because that's the only reason we are interested in cause, for us to get clues about prevention actions. Now, what can be called cause and not prevention action? Well, cause is something defined as a circumstance or action that would change the outcome. Prevention action is caused as an action, so it's not a circumstance. So the differences are subtle, but the fact that there must be a close link between the two is a fact of merit. If you don't have a close link between cause and prevention, then your definition of cause is not a useful one for prevention purposes.
So we are almost coming to an end of this session. However, I can take one question, perhaps, which is kind of related to what you just said. And the question is by Professor Ramchand Rao from India. In the intersection crash example, if there was a clear sight distance for truck driver, the driver could have seen and become overconfident and could have still caused a crash.
That is certainly true. I think one of the most neglected aspects of road safety by people like me, that is, people with engineering training, is failure to take into account the complexity of human behavior, which I would put under the terms adaptation. And in this aspect, we have to get a great deal to learn.
Yeah.
But in terms of the sentence, he still could have caused the crash. That's certainly true. But in prevention and in the definition of cause, I very carefully said change in the probability. So if removing sight distance obstructions reduces the probability of crashes, that is the core of our reason for calling it a prevention action. And when you speak of probability, you must have in mind not a specific event, the crash at the Army Corps, but all possible future crashes of that kind.
All right. Thank you, Ezra, for this covering this really, really important topic. And we still have a few questions. However, we have come to an end of this first session 5. So we will take perhaps a 5-minute break. Is that all right for you, Ezra?
I'm going to make myself a cup of tea because, as you have noticed, my
Yes.
my voice has been giving up from time to time,
Yes.
and I will be back in 5 minutes at your
All right. Perfect.